Perfect. We're recording. Lovely. So hello, everyone. Welcome to the MMI Masterskills Workshop by Halad to Health in conjunction with the Monash Biomed Society. So before we begin, we will do an acknowledgement of country. So I would like to acknowledge the traditional and rightful owners of the lands in which everyone is zooming in from today. I am zooming in from the land of the Yorta Yorta people. So I would like to pay my respect to their elders past, present, and emerging, as well as any First Nations people who are with us on Zoom today. I would like to acknowledge that this land always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Okay, so before we get into all of the MMI skills and tricks that we have to teach you today, I'll just give you a little bit of information about who we are at Halad to Health. I'm sure you've seen stuff about us before, and if you haven't, thanks for coming, because we'll teach you all about us and what we can offer you in your journey into medicine. So we actually aren't an MMI or GAMSAT company. A lot of people think we are, but we aren't. We are a not-for-profit charity that happens to run Australia's most affordable GAMSAT and MMI tuition. But the reason why we do this is to make a social impact. So all of our funds raised from our GAMSAT services and our MMI services go directly to our Halad to Health Foundation. This foundation is based in the south of the Philippines in a region called Budignong, where we run health education missions to teach children that are high school level about really important health education topics such as teen pregnancy and mental health. And recently in 2022, we went over there and we set up our first Halad to Health safe space. And what this is it's a space in a mall, which is a public area that anyone can access free mental health support. So it's really targeted to high school age students who are struggling with their mental health, needing some peer support and some psychiatric support as well. So we have psychologists and peer support mentors who stay at this space and have talk therapy for anyone who needs it. So because of all of our GAMSAT and MMI services and support from all of you, we got to set up this space. So yeah, that's who we are. We're not just an MMI service. However, we do get really, really good feedback from our GAMSAT and MMI students because we are a bunch of med students who have done the process all before. We know how hard it is. We know the struggles, so we're here just to help you out and give back to you guys as you guys are helping us out in fulfilling our social impact. So who have we got today? My name is Gabby. I am a part of the Halad to Health Operations Management team, but we also have Emily here, who is an MD MPH student at the University of Melbourne. She's also a senior MMI examiner, has been here since we first started MMIs, so she knows her stuff. We also have Steph, who is a third year at Monash in Med, and she's also one of our senior MMI examiners, been examining for a very long time, and she's also a past biomed academic as well. So any questions about Monash Biomed, the transition from biomed to med, etc., Steph is your person to contact. And I'll also just flag really quickly our podcast that we have called Making of an Incredible MD. I co-host this with Karim and Jules, and it's primarily a MMI resource. So we have heaps of mock MMI episodes that we have recorded. So get onto Spotify or Apple Podcasts, chuck it in your ears next time you go for a walk or on your commute, and you can listen to real students going through real mock MMI stations with examiners and getting feedback. Really good resource, highly recommend. But another good resource is this MMI workshop. So strap yourselves in. These girls are going to tell you how to nail your interviews. Over to you, girls.
Thanks, Gabby. We'll just make sure that Steph has access to the slides.
Yeah, I think I've now got control of them. Beautiful. All right. So I'm going to start us off for tonight. So firstly, thanks, Gabby, for that great introduction. And I was also a Halad student in the past, so can confirm that it was super helpful for me. And yeah, here I am now. So to start off with, what is an MMI interview? So I'm sure most of you have a rough idea, so I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but essentially most of your Interviews, dependent on the school you are applying for, is about a 5 to 8 minute station, where you're given a scenario and you have to answer a series of questions in related to that scenario. The number of scenarios can range, usually somewhere between 5 and 8. And typical stations include topics of ethics, personal attributes, task/explain stations, and acting stations. And essentially, it is really key, once you do find out what school you're going to, that you do understand the details of your exact interview and prepare for that interview and what that specific school tests a lot of. For example, if you do have the opportunity to interview at Monash, you are definitely going to get a lot of ethical questions, and that's something you need to practice. So read up on your university. Moving along, so the different types of stations, let's break them down a bit further. Let's start off with the classic ethics station, which Monash absolutely loves. And if you do have the opportunity to continue into medicine, you will be continuing this ethics of medicine that Monash love to teach as well. So I guess if you aren't familiar with kind of ethical situations and how to tackle them, this is something you really need to read up on across the next month or so prior to your interview. Personally, I wasn't very good at this prior to the interview process, so don't be too alarmed if you're in a similar boat at the minute. So the purpose of the station is to see how you approach ethical problems, because doctors are obviously required to follow an ethical framework in the way they practice. So common topics which are tested right up there, first and foremost, is your 4 pillars: autonomy, justice, beneficence, and non-maleficence. If you don't understand any of these terms, I would go look up on them and really understand the ins and outs. Other things include empathy, informed consent, truth-telling, confidentiality, professional boundaries. The list kind of goes on for ethics. So if you can spend a bit of time understanding the ins and outs of each of those ethical considerations and issues, that will really benefit you for your preparations. Now, there we go. So how to prepare for, oh, sorry, this is going forward, not backwards. Okay, so how to prepare for the ethical situation. So I personally think it's really important to list a bunch of ethical topics, such as, for example, I had this in my ethics this week. Research participants in challenge or controlled infectious studies should be paid a rate higher with the risk in mind. Sorry, that was poorly explained. So participants of studies should be paid a higher rate if they face an increased risk in the trials. So looking at this kind of topic, you can break that down into your 4 pillars and dot point them and make a consideration of how each of those pillars affects the ethical question. I do personally think this is the best way to do it, but you can also look at it from different frameworks, such as like who, what, when, where, and why, individual, community, and government models as well. One thing I do kind of suggest, though, unless you're very unless you're very, very knowledgeable in each of the pillars and how exactly they relate to the topic, I wouldn't be dropping the words of beneficence and non-maleficence unless you're extremely confident in that, just because you could, at the other end of the interview, have someone who has a degree in ethics or something else. And if you make a mistake in that, it could reflect poorly. But moving along, definitely practicing all these different stations a lot. Your typical ones of like a teenager wanting to access the pill, and whether that is ethically justifiable, and go through to those topics. So that is definitely something that, if you have a Monash medicine interview, is key, but key for basically all universities anyways. Moving along to the next one. So personal attribute stations. So this is also another classic to come up in most of the different schools of medicine. Firstly, to start off with, I suggest exploring different experiences you've had in your life, whether it be work, volunteering, or group projects. I think this is a really good first area to start with, and do some reflection. And in each of these experiences, try to point down strengths and weaknesses during these experiences, different adversities you've faced, achievements, stresses, teamwork, all that kind of that's pointed down. And then when you come up to a station in an interview, although it might not be precisely exactly what you've personally experienced in your life, you can use experiences that you've had to try and answer these questions and enhance your responses. At the end of the day, I do believe, if done well, if you bring experiences into a response, your response is usually stronger than if you were just to say what you would have done in a situation. So I definitely think this is a great way to start, just some personal reflection, and also just good for your own personal development as well. Moving along.
Yeah, amazing. So I'll jump in.
Ooh, sorry,
Yeah.
I think there was one other slide here. So just just a couple of dot points about like figure out who you are as a person, figure out what your weaknesses are, strengths are. Don't pull out the basic weakness of I just try to do everything. Oh, what's the classic one? A lot of people say I just like put my hand up for everything and I become overwhelmed. So I think just try to think a bit more deeply about a weakness, but obviously something that's not too bad either. And then obviously, why do you want to do medicine? Sit down and have a good think about exactly why. And lastly, just this, in terms of your structure of response, I am a strong believer in the STAR response. So that's situation, task, action, response. By having a really clear method of how you explain a past event or storyline is really important, because people can get really lost along the way. At the end of the day, you've got no PowerPoint slides or anything for anyone to follow along. It's simply your voice, and therefore you really need to be clear with how you're explaining a story, and make sure that STAR response is no more than 60 to 90 seconds when you're practicing. But yeah, I'll move on to Emily now.
Cool, thanks. So sorry I cut you off, getting too keen. So yeah, the stations I'll be talking about are task and explain stations, and also acting stations, which are really quite different to the stations that Steph has just discussed. These tend to be a bit more like objective driven and testing things more like your logical reasoning and how you think under pressure. So task or explain stations, that's where you do just that. You usually have to explain something to another person. I guess it seems quite simple on the surface, and at its core it is, but it can definitely become one of the most challenging stations, especially when under pressure. So I did quite a few of these stations actually in my interview. So I'm a student at Melbourne, so they definitely go heavy on these types of stations. So examples of explain stations include things like detechnicalization stations, so where you may need to explain like a scientific or academic term to, say, a lay person or a child, or just basically someone without the same educational background as you. Or another station, which is a really good example, is I had to explain to my examiner how to draw this abstract picture except there was like a wall up between myself and the examiner, so I couldn't use like my hands or draw pictures. It all had to be verbally. So yeah, that's really good examples of things that might pop up in a task or explain type stations. So what they're trying to do is, one, test your communication skills. They're trying to, like I mentioned, test your ability to think logically under pressure, and also often your ability to self-reflect. So a really good example of this is in my station of having to explain how to draw this abstract picture. I honestly, I felt like I had butchered the entire station. I'm getting confused with my lefts and rights and just all these little silly things under pressure. But thankfully, often these stations have a question at the end where you can sort of redeem yourself with self-reflection. And it's really important in those moments that you're honest. So for example, I had explained, I didn't think that I did this as well as I thought I had, but you can't just stop there. You need to self-reflect and say, why, what could I, and why was it not as good as you think you could have done, and really be clear in those things, and also reflect on, what could you do better in the future, and how could you improve that? Because that's a massive part of medicine. You start off really junior and you're constantly learning. So showing that ability to self-reflect is definitely really important. I'll get you on the next slide. Thanks, Steph. Cool. So how to prepare for these stations. So even if your uni doesn't directly assess these stations, the skills gained from practicing these stations are definitely transferable to pretty much any other station type. Like I mentioned, at their core, it's logical reasoning and communication, and they're fundamental to every station. They do feel quite unnatural to start off with, and can be quite challenging. So it's really, really important to practice. And also practice them sort of out loud and in your, as opposed to just in your head. So make sure you're grabbing friends. For example, with a DTEC station, it's really easy to think, oh, I know how to explain that. But when you actually have to explain that for, say, 2 minutes out loud, it's really a lot more challenging than you think it might be. With these type of stations, it's obviously impossible to have practiced or rehearsed every single situation. So it's just about practicing in order to build those skills. So if you do get thrown something on the day that you're less familiar with, the skills are there to be able to approach that, logically, clearly, and work your way through it. My biggest tip, which is really important for these stations, but also applies to all stations, is just take a moment to compose yourself before jumping in. Think how you're going to approach it, try and do it, really logically and stepwise, because if you just jump in straight away, it's really easy just for things to get a bit jumbled. So I think that's it for that station. I'll move on to the acting stations. Again, a bit of a strange station, can be really intimidating. But I honestly think it is a station that is really quite reflective of the medical student experience. So when you go up to a patient in the hospital to take their history, it's not necessarily a normal interaction. You have an objective. It is almost a bit of a performance, like acting. You have to be really considered in what you say and also be receptive to what patients are feeling and saying. And that's exactly the same for these acting type station. You really want to be receptive to the behaviour of the other person, to show that you're listening and able to demonstrate empathy. So an example, when I had my acting station, I had to pretend I was sitting next to a lady on the train. And as I got talking to her, I found out she was sort of having some family issues and was a bit down about a few things, but it wasn't unless, I actually listened and took the time to make that space for the actor to actually talk, that I got that information and then was able to demonstrate my empathy from there. So don't feel pressured in these acting stations to act the whole time. Just approach it as if you're just a normal person having a conversation with another human being. That's honestly the best way to approach it. You don't need to be talking the entire time because, like I mentioned, listening is a really important skill that you need to be able to demonstrate in these types of stations. Because most of the scenarios will be around something to do with that's quite emotionally loaded, or the person's having a hard time. So it won't be too random, the things you'll have to act out. The other key thing about acting stations is really just knowing what your role is in the scenario, and not sort of going beyond what you need to be doing. And what I mean by that is, for example, if you are the medical student in a situation and they're asking you about something, you don't want to like go step beyond what your responsibilities are and think, oh, I would do this, this, and this, or behave in this way just because it might like fit scenario best. You really need to understand who you are. So that is it. Oh, the next slide. So yeah, just how to prepare. So again, like the task and explain station, it can feel really unnatural to do. So that's why it's important to practice. It's really easy to just come up with random stations. Like I said, they're usually situations that do require empathy, or, you know, you staying calm, or you being able to listen to someone. And it will feel super awkward and probably really funny to start off with, especially if you're practicing with friends. But yeah, you just have to do it and just like get over the awkwardness and yeah, just do it, and the practice will definitely be worth it. Just reflecting on what you do and say, even things like your body language when you're practicing these types of stations is really important. And then thinking about, you know, what you can change to improve the next time. Okay, so we'll move on. So we'll jump into a practice station. So we'll go through two. I think I have the first one and Steph has the second one. So I want you to think about, I guess, given what Steph and I have said, how you might approach these types of stations. So we'll pause for a minute after each station and get you to contribute some responses in the chat if you're feeling up to it. So the first situation, so Ella is a 20-year-old female and is a long-time patient of her GP in rural Victoria. She's seen the same GP since she was a child. She wants to begin using oral contraception, but is worried about discussing this with her GP as they live in a small town, and the GP is a friend of her parents. Ella does not wish her parents to know about her decision. So if you're feeling up to it, definitely a great opportunity for practice. If you want to pop anything in the chat, I'll actually say the first question. So what do you think may be some of the ethical considerations in this scenario? So Steph had mentioned sort of the 4 pillars of ethics. So things like autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence. Yes, amazing. Confidentiality is definitely a really key theme here. Yeah, patient privacy and autonomy, really, really good. Yeah, amazing. Really good. So they're really good starts. I'll move on to the next question and then I'll show you my approach at the end. So next question might be something like, what is the significance of this situation being in a rural setting? So yeah, a key thing to approaching stations is if you're able to sort of show that you acknowledge a bit of the nuance and the complexities behind the given situation, that'll definitely elevate your responses. So what's the significance in a rural settings? Yep, amazing. Different social values outside of major cities. Yep, so making those comparisons really, really good. Yeah, lack of resources and other doctors to go and see. Yeah, it really emphasizes those concerns around confidentiality and privacy. Yeah, exactly. Really, really well done. Okay, so what actions can the GP make to do to make Ella feel comfortable? So yeah, reassure Ella of the GP's own obligations. Yeah, exactly right. So I think in these types of questions where you're asked to explain how you would do something, making sure it's sort of real clear, actionable, practical steps that you can explain to your examiner. Okay. And I'll just move to the last question before showing you how I might have approached it, is why is confidentiality important in medicine? So yeah, there's no right or wrong answers in many of these scenarios. It's just making sure that on the day you're sort of backing up your answers with some sort of justification and reasoning. That's probably the most important thing. So any ideas? So why is confidentiality important in medicine? Yeah, amazing. So trust is really fundamental to the doctor-patient relationship. Yep, access is another huge thing. We need to make sure people feel safe to be able to continue accessing the care that they need. Amazing. Yeah, professionalism. Amazing. Yeah. Yeah, it's all about patient safety and being able to protect them, yeah, both psychologically and physically. These are really good responses. So we can move on to the next slide, and I'll just talk about some points that I would consider, but you've definitely all hit the nail on the head. So for number one, what are the ethical considerations? You guys said it, confidentiality is probably the most important thing here, and it is particularly relevant in a rural setting where there's only one sort of healthcare practitioner or few that are available to access care. You guys also mentioned this, but yeah, you want to discuss how her being concerned about confidentiality may prove to be a barrier. And you could even go on to discuss, what are some of the downstream complications or implications of this if Ella wasn't to access care for this reason. So making sure that when you are discussing these different things, your ideas are quite sequential and that they build on one another. And definitely start with the most important first and show your ability to prioritize your ideas. So the second question is significance of being in a rural setting. So it's pretty similar to things we discussed. It means there might be limited alternatives to seek care, and it's going to impact on how comfortable Ella feels in seeking care and the trust she has with her GP. So the next question about what actions the GP can take to make Ella feel comfortable. So like we mentioned in the chat, reiterating what confidentiality is and what that means for her and her care, and also mentioning things about making sure that the GP is demonstrating that they're listening to Ella and acknowledging her concerns. So listening and acknowledging patient concerns is a way of demonstrating empathy, and that should be shown in pretty much every station type. So just having those discussions about confidentiality will also sort of in turn provide her with some reassurance. And other things you can mention is even just like giving her, like I mentioned before, so it's really important to come up with sort of actionable or practical things. So maybe giving her another appointment in a week's time after you've had this discussion about confidentiality, so that she has time to sort of absorb that information and make that decision for herself as to what she feels comfortable with, is a good example of something sort of practical that you can do to address the situation. So why is confidentiality important in medicine? As we discussed, things like patient safety, ensuring continued access to care, building rapport, and it's just important for the therapeutic relationship more generally. So I'll pass over to Steph for the second scenario.
Thank you, Emily. Just on that as well, typically I always find these questions also have the added layer that the individual seeking the oral contraceptive pill is under 18. So just have a look into I'm going to pronounce this wrong probably, but the Gillick principle, where individuals under the age of 18 can make informed consent depending on the circumstance. So have a look into that law as well. But moving along, so another classic station, I had this come up. So you are working in a uni group project that makes up a major portion of your end of year grade. One of your group members, Miriam, does not complete her section and is not replying to the group conversation. The group project is due next week. So I'm sure some of us have had this actually happen. So you can reflect on that. And to start off with the first question, once again, if you can throw in the chat, just so we can get some conversation going. So what are some of the issues here? Sorry, I've managed to lose the chat. Give me 1 second, people. Lack of communication. Yep. Anything else? Responsibility, attempt to approach Miriam via the phone or in person to discuss an issue that may be preventing her from completing the project. If Miriam cannot be reached, possibly discussing with academic in charge. Beautiful. That's yeah, so not always jumping to conclusions of why Miriam might not be responding, even though there is obviously the potential that it is simply like laziness. This is not something you jump to or assume, because there is usually a bigger picture going on. Beautiful. So next question is, what would your next steps in the scenario be? Anyone have any ideas? The next step, alternative communication. Yeah. Seek out anyone the cohort may know. Okay, loving these answers, because you'd be surprised at how many people want to go to like the dean of some department after one attempt of trying to contact Miriam. So that's great. And next question is, describe a time when you have had to resolve conflict in a group setting. So for this one, it's too hard to kind of throw in the chat. So I'll just run through that, but just have a think for like 30 seconds if you can think of a time, just individually. And this is a typical station. So I do recommend, if you don't have a situation coming to mind right now, that you jot this down as a task for you to complete some point this week, where you reflect on a time that you have had to resolve conflict in a group setting. Moving along, how should medical professionals deal with conflict in the workplace? If you just want to throw something in the chat, and then I'll run through each of these. Any ideas of how medical professionals should deal with conflict? Calmly and methodically, respectfully and maturely. Speak directly to the individual conflict. Yep, awesome answers. All right, let's move along to each of the questions now. Now, to start off with, this is like a little way I kind of reminded myself when I had a station like this come up in an MMI, is sympathize, then strategize. So it is very typical of a med student to jump into a situation and just want to solve it straight away. But I think if you can actually apply this kind of thinking to so many stations, of sympathize and strategize. So we want to sympathize that Miriam's well-being, as well as the well-being of the rest of the team, is really important, and sympathize that there might be a reason behind why she's not responding, rather than jumping to that she's being lazy or something else has happened. But it brings up issues of teamwork, fairly sharing the workload, team dynamic, professionalism, and completing assessment requirements on time and effectively. So all of these are really key aspects of being in a team situation, which you're constantly facing in your day-to-day kind of medicine if you do pursue a career in medicine, and hence why this question is kind of tackling these issues. So next steps in the scenario is obviously try your best to check in with Miriam, and great thinking by one of the students to contact someone who might know Miriam before seeking help from a coordinator or supervisor to see if they can make contact with the individual, or to see if potentially special consideration can be applied to your group. So think about what the next steps are. If Miriam is unavailable, you can start to talk about equally dividing that extra proportion of the task amongst the team so that you all share that little bit of extra burden of workload rather than one person taking on a lot of burden in the team. So describe a time. This is where you really want to get your classic STAR response down packed. So being really succinct and demonstrating how you have personally resolved conflict is a really hard but good skill to have. So I do recommend going through different experiences in your life, work, socially, uni, volunteering, and run through different experiences and what you've kind of learnt from it, and if you've faced conflict and other things as well. But yeah, so situation, task, action, reflection. That reflection step is really key, and it kind of enhances your response if you're able to add that in. Finally, how should medical professionals deal with conflict in the workplace? So care and support, like listening to each other, keeping the whole team and end goal in mind. I think something key here also is having a good team plan prior to starting a team task. I guess it's kind of like your your asthma action plan that you give out in a GP clinic. So it's like having that asthma action plan in your team environments of what's going to happen when things don't go exactly how is planned. And that is a really good element to add to your discussion in a question such as this. So, is there anything else I was going to say? So I do recommend demonstrating your own experience, even if it is not particularly asked in the question, but at the same time, don't lie. When you're in a high pressure environment, you can tell the people who are crumbling because they're making up a story on the spot. So that's why you really need to spend the time now reflecting on different situations rather than trying to make up one in the interview. Okay. So I think Emily, jumping in now.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Steph. So what do MMIs look like at each uni? So I'm not going to sort of go through the numbers. We've just got a couple of slides here that are sort of some indication of the number of stations and the time per station you might expect at some of the unis. It is getting sort of increasingly harder to find this information and make sure it's accurate because a lot of the universities have been changing their structure ever since COVID, and a lot of them have moved online and subsequently changed structure. So definitely don't take this as gospel, and whatever information you receive with your interview offer, like definitely focus on that. And that's the same as Steph mentioned before with knowing what themes to be sort of like studying for these interviews as well. So it's also really important to practice to time. I think that's probably the biggest takeaway from this. So if you know how many stations and the time, not only for the response time, but also the reading time, because reading time is also thinking time. Definitely be very, very strict with your practice. Don't just say, oh yeah, I would get that done in 2 minutes or whatever. Like practice to time, especially with online interviews these days. Like if it's pre-recorded situation, it's going to cut you off. So the next slide is just a few more of those. But like I said, I don't think there's too much value in actually reading out these numbers. So for the next slide, just a bit of a note on panel interviews. So another number of unis do these, or a combination of the MMIs and the panel interviews. So yeah, they're a bit longer. I haven't personally done these, but from friends who have, it usually is more grounded in those personal experiences and requiring those like deep reflections and learnings from your personal experiences. So like Steph mentioned, it's really important to have personal examples and experiences sort of up your sleeve, ready to go, and have those reflections as well to go with them. You don't want them sounding rehearsed, like you don't want to say this scenario, the experience word for word every time, but you want to, you know, familiarize yourself with it so that when you do get asked something related to that in a panel interview, it comes across really naturally and you're able to show that yet deeper reflection and analysis. So questions are based on things like achievements, times where you've demonstrated key personal attributes, your learning style, motivation to study medicine, discussion of healthcare systems, etc. So making sure that they're as personal as possible. Like you don't want them to be super generic. You want those reflections to be quite personal. And the next slide. So again, similar to as we've mentioned, preparing is just practice. So think about the questions you might receive. So that just means like looking at the themes that the university has sort of outlined and brainstorming according to those themes. That's probably your best bet in terms of having, you know, the right personal experiences up your sleeve. You know, have a clear understanding of what you want and why you want to be in medicine. You know, be ready and practice talking about yourself, because it can be really challenging talking about things like both strengths and weaknesses. So yeah, I think that's pretty much everything for that. When do these interviews happen? So this is just a very general timeline. So early September is when the GemSAS interviews offers are released. September, October, you'll have most of your interviews, and hopefully by early November, you'll be starting to find out your offer places. I think an exception might be Bond, which is later interviews. So the next slide, I'll start off, but Steph can definitely add to this, because I'm sure we both have some sort of little gems of advice. So on the day, make sure you're arriving early if it is in person, know where your venue is, what time, and allow for delays, because you're going to be stressed as it is. You don't need, you know, a train delay or something to just amp that up, and then by the time you get there, you know, you're a bit of a mess. Be confident in your preparation. I think even if you'll be practicing the right stuff, but even if you haven't been, just the fact that you have practiced is going to be helpful and is going to add to your confidence. So yeah, just on the day, you guys are here today looking for advice, looking for tips. You guys are going to be the ones that practice. So just have confidence that you've worked hard and it's going to pay off on the day, because it definitely will. Treat each station as its separate interview, because they are usually assessed separately, except for, say, maybe something like a panel. It's really easy to get flustered in a station that you feel like you might have done poorly at, but remember, they're assessed separately for most of the time. So, you know, take a breath between stations, compose yourself, and approach the new one, you know, with a sort of renewed mindset, like, okay, the last one might have botched it. It's fine. It's done. Now's my time to sort of shine and show what I can do again. Take the time, I guess, just on that point of getting flustered. It's okay if you do as well. If you need to ask the examiner to sort of repeat the question in the station or take a minute to take a breath and compose yourself, that's totally fine. In one of my early stations in my interview, I'm pretty sure I asked the examiner about 4 or 5 times, can you please repeat the question, because I was so nervous. And I felt ridiculous for doing that. I was like, oh my gosh, like I've botched it. And, you know, it was probably not great, but I needed to hear it that many times to understand it. And that meant that at the end of the day, like I could give an answer because I understood what the question was, instead of just, you know, floundering, not wanting to ask the examiner to repeat just for the sake of it, and answering something that was completely irrelevant. You know, I did what I needed to do to get that answer out. So just, do what you need to do, take a breath and keep moving on. Do you have anything else to add, Steph?
Yeah, definitely covered a lot there, and definitely agree with all of her advice. Yeah, just also in the day and age of where Zooming most of these kind of interviews, be prepared for the classic Zoom to fail. My friend had his examiner just drop out halfway through him answering his questions. Eventually he rejoined in, but they had to keep moving through. So he only answered 3 minutes of one station. And he had to compose himself and just move on to the next station and forget about it. And it obviously wasn't his fault at the end of the day, but they don't have time to allow for you to keep talking because they need to move through the stations. So they will look at you for that 3 minutes and be able to give you a mark for those 3 minutes if something like that was to occur. But obviously that rarely happens, but can happen. And I guess expect the unexpected. Also, just make sure with the Zoom setting that you are set up for a smooth running Zoom session. So practice with your Zoom with friends interviewing when you're doing your preparation to make sure you do have good quality sound, that your room doesn't echo, all those kind of basic things that hopefully by now most of us have kind of worked that out. And yeah, I feel like everything else covered really well. So I'll just move along. These are just some more statistics about like how many people get into each university based on 2021. They're also now kind of keeping this quite close to their chest, how many people they're letting in and things like that. I guess for Monash, the beauty of it is GAMSAT is not taken into account. And once you kind of get over that minimum WAM, it is debatable, but most people think that they do just look at the interviews. So really can't emphasize enough how important it is to kind of spend the month prep focusing on trying to improve your interview skills. And because there is a significant weighting, not just Monash, but all universities on this interview these days. So it's really important. Also take into consideration if you are willing to do a bonded placement or a full fee paying placement. I think one thing to also consider when you're doing the ordering of which university you want to go to. For example, if you put Melbourne first, but you also put, I will do the full fee paying, you might have got an offer at Deakin, but because your Melbourne one was first, even if it's the full paying one, you will be given the full paying at Melbourne. So just have a think about the fact, are you willing to pay the full fee to go to a university, or would you rather exclude the full fee and go down your list of different universities? Also speaking about, but that's actually, you guys have already chosen that actually now, haven't you? Most of you would have if you're applying for interviews this year. So I won't dwell on that too much, and I won't dwell on this too much because most of you would have selected the special entry schemes already, as they would have been done towards the start of the year. In terms of just preparation, obviously practice makes perfect. Personally, what worked for me is I had another mate who was doing interview prep, and every second night we would sit down on a Zoom for an hour and run through questions with each other. Make sure you pick a friend who is willing to tell you the truth and not sugarcoat it, because that is really key. And stay up to date with stay up to date with the news. I personally recommend, I listen to a podcast called The Daily Oz. It's like 6 minutes a day, really easy just to get a quite a quick but informative dose of what's happening in the current news, because they do bring up topics in the interview that are relevant to the current news, especially like, for example, in Queensland, if you're doing Queensland University interview, you're more likely to get something on I've forgotten the word for it now, the voluntary assisted dying. So because that's a recent legislation that has just come in, and therefore is more topical and something that's more likely to come up. Do your own research, especially on the university itself. What are their kind of main focuses? For Monash, that is ethics. So get used to it. And that would be my advice. Anything you have else to add, Em?
Yeah, no, you definitely covered most of it. Just like a bit of an extra note on, so Steph said keeping up to date with what's happening in the world and current affairs is really important. And we haven't spoken about it lots today, but as I'm also a Master of Public Health student, I'll put my public health spin on it. So a lot of current affairs and a lot of stations might actually be around public health issues that are pertinent sort of in Australia today as well. So doing your own research just to familiarise yourself with them as well is going to be really useful. You can easily Google Australia public health issues, and I'm pretty sure there's a Vic or Australian government website that will come up. And just familiarise yourself with some of those, and things like the social determinants of health as well is really important, because that's sort of the foundational stuff that is the reason why so many things do come up in our headlines today. So that'd be my other little extra bit of advice there. But otherwise, Steph, you definitely covered it all. Okay.
Beautiful. Yeah, definitely agree with Em on that. Public health, rural health, and Indigenous health are three kind of areas we haven't touched on tonight, simply because we don't have heaps of time with you guys, but are three important topics that you need to know the ins and outs of before your interview. So definitely start working on that. I think, and listen to our podcast. So that goes through heaps more things that we have not had time to share tonight. And I'm going to jump back to Gabby now to just wrap up tonight's session. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Steph. Yes, as Steph mentioned, podcast very useful for MMI practice in particular, but we also have some general information episodes as well, which do cover public health topics like rural health, First Nations health, and we have a podcast about COVID, but everyone's probably a bit over that to listen to it, but it's there. So yeah, definitely listen to the podcast. It's free. If you don't have Apple Podcasts or Spotify or anything like that, the episodes are on YouTube as well, if that is easier for you. But here's an example of a couple of episodes that are really, really high yield to listen to. These are purely practice stations. So a student comes in, practices a full mock to time with the examiner, and then the examiner goes through feedback with that student. So you can pause the station to practice what you would say back, and then listen to what the student says and listen to the feedback. And I think it's a really good way to practice on top of, Zooming your friends, doing in-person practice with your friends, doing your readings and that sort of stuff. But is there any final questions for our fantastic tutors and examiners tonight, Steph and Emily? They ran through so many fantastic tips, stuff that I wish that I heard when I was prepping for MMIs, but that's okay. I figured it out. Feel free to keep sending them through. But what I do want you to do is really make sure you reflect on this session, because a lot of information was said to you. There's a lot of resources that were given to you as well. And it can be really overwhelming, especially if you've only just started in your MMI prep journey. And we really want to see you all get into med and follow your dream path. Okay. So the best thing to do to get out of this session is to write down one thing that you've learned and how you will improve on one of the station types that were given today, whichever one that you thought this is the hardest. Make sure you write down how you're going to plan to prep for that station and improve in the future. Dean says, what do Halad offer post this session? Good question, Dean. I will answer that in just a moment. Emma, thanks for putting together the masterclass. I had a question. I was wondering how many questions usually are asked per MMI station for Monash. Really good question. Oh, can you guys hear that music? 1 second. My laptop is playing music. Sorry about that. I've turned it off now. So Monash scenarios are typically 3 to 5 questions per station, but normally more questions, the 4 or 5. They usually have quite a few more stations than other people, than other universities. Okay, keep sending through the questions whilst I answer Dean's question about what do Halad offer. So what to from here? Where do you go from here? First of all, we have a heap of free resources for you to use. Make sure you follow us on Facebook or like us on Facebook. We post a lot of our free resources through there, as well as our Instagram page. Em and Steph, if you're able to send through the link of that in the chat, that would be fantastic. But it's just Halad to Health at Facebook. The second thing is you can sign up for our virtual MMI circuits. So what this is, our virtual MMI circuits are really flexible. Do it in your own time at your own pace. So we send you the stations, the full circuit. So you get the different stations depending on which university one that you'd like to sign up for. For example, if you're signing up for the Monash University one, you will get 6 stations with their attached questions that you have to work through under Monash timed conditions. You record yourself on your laptop and send it through and submit it to us. And then our examiners watch your videos and give you feedback based on our marking rubric, and you'll get scores at the end as well. So you get written feedback, scores, and a video feedback from our examiners as well. So the really good thing about this is it replicates a lot of online interview platforms, such as, what's that silly platform called? Sonru. It mimics that. So if you're doing that type of interview, I highly recommend doing this type of practice, because you should practice the way that you're going to compete, as that Olympian said one time. Don't know who they are, but it's very good to make sure that you're practicing the way that you are going to be on the day. This is particularly relevant for GemSAS style interviews, anyone interviewing at Uni Melb. And it's a bit more flexible. So if you're not free during our live circuit times, it doesn't matter. You can do this anytime and submit it online at any time, and you'll get your feedback within 72 hours. So this is $149 for a full mock MMI round. And then we have our live circuits. So these are still online, but they're through the Zoom platform. So you'll actually be seeing the examiners real time. And these are on at specific dates and specific times. These are really limited availability. We only have, 8 to 10 students per time slot. So they're really, really competitive to get into. So I highly recommend not hesitating in signing up for these, because first in, best dress. You can come to GemSAS ones, which are pretty general, not university specific, but more tailored towards your Uni Melb Deakin style interviews. And then there's the Monash specific weekends, but there's only 2 slots of those. So again, super, super competitive to get into. So if you'd like to do the full Zoom circuit where you get to talk to your examiner at the end, and get that feedback in real time and practice the whole circuit back to back on a Zoom platform, I highly recommend signing up for this. It's $179 for the full mock round as well. We also, with these sessions, have a cohort review. So what that is after the weekend, we will have all our examiners jump on Zoom and give a general overview as to what the cohort did well and what the cohort needs to work on. And you'll be able to see where your score actually puts you in that cohort. So, if the average score was 16 and you were scoring 18, brilliant. Awesome, you know where you sat in that cohort. And I think that's a really nice way for you to get some really tangible feedback and see what you should improve on. And this is just a reminder of the awesome feedback that we get from students. We've helped so many students with many seasons before about getting into med, not just MMIs, but GAMSAT as well. So we've seen a lot of students come through, and, you know, we're really passionate about helping you guys reach your dreams. So let us help you. Now, we have a special offer for you guys. So there is a special little promo code, Workshop 2023, where you get 10% off virtual and live circuits. And it's valid for the next 48 hours. So you can sign up and get 10% off all of those virtual ones that I spoke about and the live circuits. So I highly recommend jumping in ASAP to get access to that. Now, I'll send the link in the chat, unless Em and Steph, you have the link there. Sorry, I had it before, but my laptop freaks out a little bit when I'm recording. When would you recommend a second year to start preparing for MMI? I'll just answer this question while I'm getting the link. So a second year, I wouldn't recommend starting preparing until a bit closer. I mean, you could, but I think the best thing to do is wait until you're sort of submitting your GEMSAS application or your application to start med, or until you even get the offer for an interview. But as Steph said earlier, I think a good month is a really good time. I personally wouldn't do any less than a month. But yeah, each to their own. Definitely wouldn't start in second year, but it's good to know the general overview. An event like this, I think, is really helpful as you get to know general overview and sort of what you should prepare in the future. So I just sent that link in the chat. That has all of our resources. It's sort of a giant link for you to access, as well as our link tree as well, that has all of our free resources and everything else on there. So make sure you take a screenshot of this promo code, Workshop 2023, and use it within the next 2 hours, 2 days. 2 hours would be chaos. The next 2 days to ensure that you get your 10% off.
Gabby,
yep.
Just in the Q&A, apparently it says it's sold out online. Is that true?
Oh, it wasn't this morning. I really hope it's not. I will check with Carleen straight after this session. And Carleen will send out the recording. So she will let you know tonight what the issue with that is. But keep refreshing tonight. Yeah, I hadn't heard that it was sold out. I hope not. But yes, keep an eye on your emails.
Yeah, apparently the Halad website's working, but not via the GAMSAT website. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but maybe if you can maybe check that it's the right, like 2023, some of the old ones. Oh, the other way around.
Oh, yeah.
GAMSAT works. Oh.
GAMSAT works. Okay. I'll just send those 2 links again. I'm not really sure. I can't really.
We'll make sure the right links are sent through, just in case it was an old link that was sent through. Sometimes I know that's happened in the past.
Yeah. Ryan, did you just want to send the link that you have open, if that's okay? That would make sense.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks.
I did it last night, so I don't have it on me at the moment.
Oh, okay. All good. All good. All right. Well, I'll just resend this one because I'm pretty sure that that's working. But in your email after this event anyway, Carleen will have the correct links. Also, it's on our Instagram. So if you go onto our Instagram and see the latest post, it has the links that definitely work. But I thought I just sent that link, but that's okay. Maybe I didn't. There was another question there, I think.
Yeah, I'll just answer the one in the Q&A just live quickly. So in regards to direct entry med MMIs, it is relevant, but not our personally targeted audience. However, people who are doing the direct entry pathway are more than welcome to join, as you'll be gaining the same benefit from these sessions.
If you do 2 practice MMIs, will the questions be the same? Really good questions. So no, our MMIs circuits change each weekend. So if you do 2 within the same weekend, they will be. But if you choose like 2 different weekends, they will be completely different, as well as the Monash ones from the GemSAS are also different. And if you sign up to the virtual ones and say that you want 2 different ones, we can give you 2 different sets of mocks. So no, they won't be the same. Just make sure you communicate what you want when you purchase, especially for the virtual ones, so we can give you 2 different ones. Any further questions? Oh, do the virtual ones reflect the uni of your choice? Yes, yep. So we have the GemSAS ones, which are more general and cover a lot of universities, specifically Uni Melbourne and Deakin. Then we also have University of Notre Dame specific ones, Monash specific ones, and Griffith Uni specific ones. Any other questions?